Looking back, I think about the life we had built, or at least the one I thought we had. My wife, Lena, was someone I trusted wholeheartedly, maybe too much. We'd been married for 12 years, and though I knew she could charm anyone, I never thought she'd turn that charm towards someone who would put us here. Together, we had a son, Michael. He's just 15, caught between childhood and something that's supposed to be adulthood, and the last thing I ever wanted was for him to have a front row seat to a marriage falling apart. Everything was good, really good, I thought. Lena and I had our rituals, the things that tied us together even on the busiest days. Coffee in the morning, Friday nights reserved for family movie marathons, weekend hikes when the weather allowed. For most of those 12 years, I honestly thought we were one of the lucky ones. Friends would joke about us being that perfect family, and although that used to embarrass me, I started to believe it too. Lena was a beautiful woman, the kind of woman who could hold the attention of any room she walked into, and I trusted her. I never imagined she'd betray that, and so deeply. The changes were subtle at first. She started coming home late, telling me she was staying longer at work. Then she was spending more time on her phone, always tucking it away the moment I walked into the room. Michael noticed it, too. He'd comment on how distant she seemed. I shrugged it off as stress, work-related pressure, or maybe even just the strains of raising a teenager. We were all dealing with something. After all, it was Michael's 15th birthday when I felt the first pang of suspicion. Lena had stepped out of the room to take a call, her tone hushed and unfamiliar. But it wasn't until I saw her standing close, whispering with one of Michael's friends after the party that something inside me snapped. At the time, I brushed it off as an irrational reaction. It's nothing, I told myself. She's just being friendly. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But it was worse than I could ever have imagined. I tried to ignore the growing doubts. For a while, I convinced myself I was overreacting, letting my mind create problems where none existed. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, and I couldn't shake how strange she'd been acting around Michael's friend, Adam. Adam was 16, one of those quiet, polite kids who always said hello and even offered to help clean up after Michael's birthday party. I'd never thought twice about him before. But that night, the way Lena had stood close to him, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, that feeling just wouldn't leave me. Over the following weeks, I noticed things I hadn't paid attention to before. Lena started taking longer showers, spending more time getting ready before going out, even if it was just a quick trip to the grocery store. She was more guarded with her phone, keeping it face down on the table and always nearby, even taking it to bed with her. She'd never done that before. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just going through a phase, something that would pass on its own. But the worry gnawed at me. One Saturday afternoon, when Lena was supposedly out shopping, Michael invited a few friends over to watch a game. As I headed downstairs to check on the kids, I heard her voice, Lena's voice, coming from the basement. She was on speakerphone, and she was laughing, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in years. I paused just out of sight, straining to hear. Adam's voice followed hers, muffled but unmistakable. It felt like a punch to the gut. I could feel my heart pounding as I stood there, listening to snippets of their conversation. It was light, casual, almost too casual. But there was something in her tone, a warmth she rarely showed to anyone else lately, especially not to me. My mind raced, questioning everything. Why would Lena be calling Michael's friend? Was it innocent, or was there something more to it? The call ended, and I retreated back up the stairs, a mix of anger, confusion, and denial swirling through me. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just being friendly, motherly even. But then, why did it feel so wrong? The questions kept me up that night, replaying every conversation, every look, every odd behavior I'd noticed over the past few weeks. Lena seemed oblivious to my unease, curled up beside me in bed like nothing had changed. I wanted to shake her, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it yet, to ask the questions that might shatter everything. In the days that followed, I started to watch her more closely, looking for any sign that might confirm or deny my worst fears. I'd catch her glancing at her phone with a smile or excusing herself to take calls at odd hours, and each time, the knot in my stomach tightened. The life we'd built felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and the more I tried to hold on, the less certain I became of the woman lying beside me. I decided I couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was happening, I needed to know the truth. So, one evening after Lena had gone to bed, I waited until her breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep and quietly slipped out of bed. Her phone lay charging on the nightstand, and I reached for it, feeling guilty even as I did it. I had never invaded her privacy before, but this was different. This was a desperation for answers I hoped I wouldn't find. To my surprise, her phone was unlocked. Maybe she thought I'd never check, or maybe she'd forgotten to put the passcode back on after restarting it. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that, with trembling hands, I was holding a doorway to whatever was going on behind my back. The first few apps didn't reveal anything unusual. Texts, emails, most of it seemed mundane. But when I opened her social media app, a flood of notifications spilled across the screen. I scrolled, scanning until I found a message thread with Adam. As I opened it, my chest tightened, and I held my breath, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But I wasn't. The messages started off innocent enough, like a casual back and forth about some school project Adam had been helping Michael with. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. There were inside jokes, comments that hinted at secret meetings, and subtle innuendos. Lena was being playful in a way she hadn't been with me for years. And Adam, young, awkward Adam, was flirting back. One message caught my eye, making my stomach turn. Wish you could have stayed longer. Miss that smile of yours. Another, a response from Adam, simply said, next time. I'll make sure no one interrupts us. My hands started to shake as I read on, realizing that whatever I'd feared was happening wasn't just a suspicion, it was real. This was no friendship. This was my wife crossing lines I hadn't thought she was even capable of crossing. And with a boy who'd been a guest in our home, a friend of our son. The enormity of it hit me like a wave, leaving me feeling hollow, like someone had sucked the air out of my lungs. I felt dizzy, unsteady on my feet. I gripped the side of the nightstand, trying to regain my balance. I looked over at Lena, sleeping peacefully as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I couldn't stay in that room, couldn't bear to look at her. I needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my car keys, leaving the house as quietly as possible. Once I was outside, I barely felt the night chill. My mind was a blur of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. My feet carried me to the car, where I sat gripping the steering wheel, wondering how I was going to confront her, how I'd ever tell Michael, how I'd survive the fallout of what I'd just discovered. I spent the night in my car, parked a few blocks away from our house, replaying the messages over and over in my mind. There was no sleep, only an endless loop of questions I had no answers for. The hardest one, the one I couldn't stop asking, was why? How could she risk everything? Not just our marriage, but Michael's well-being, his trust. The anger kept welling up, but right behind it was a wave of sadness I could barely keep down. By morning, I had no plan, no strategy. I only knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed to talk to someone, and as much as it broke me, I knew it had to be Michael. He deserved the truth, and as much as I wanted to protect him from this, he was too old to be kept in the dark. If Lena was going to risk our family for a boy his age, then Michael had a right to know. I came back home, the house silent in that early morning way. I took a deep breath, bracing myself as I headed to Michael's room. I knocked softly, waiting until he murmured a sleepy, "Come in." "Hey, Bud," I said, trying to sound calm. "Can we talk?" Michael sat up, blinking away the sleep. He rubbed his eyes, clearly confused. "What's wrong, Dad?" I searched for the right words, but couldn't find anything that felt good or right. There was no good way to say this. "There's something going on with your mom," I started. His eyes narrowed in confusion, a hint of worry creeping in. I think she's been seeing someone else." My voice wavered as I said it. "What?" His voice was barely a whisper. I nodded, trying to keep steady. "I know it's hard to hear, but I found messages. It's complicated." The worry in his eyes deepened. "What do you mean? Who is she seeing?" I took a deep breath, my heart racing. It's Adam. The name fell between us like a bomb. His face paled as he processed what I just said. Adam? Adam, my friend? He looked at me like I was speaking another language, like he couldn't believe a word I was saying. I wish I was wrong, Michael. I wish I'd imagined it. But I found messages, things that shouldn't have been there. He shook his head, his face contorting between disbelief and anger. This can't be real, he muttered. Adam wouldn't do that. And Mom wouldn't either. He was grasping for some lifeline, something to hold on to. I wanted to give him a way out, some comfort, but I didn't have it to offer. I had seen the truth myself, and there was no pretending it didn't exist. I know this is a lot, I said gently, reaching out to him. I know it doesn't make sense, but I had to tell you. I couldn't keep this from you. His expression hardened. I need to talk to her, he said, his voice laced with a newfound bitterness. I need to know why she'd do this. Seeing the pain on his face gutted me. This wasn't something a kid should have to carry. But it was too late to shield him, and now, all I could do was be there beside him as he faced the same betrayal that was tearing me apart. Michael's face was a mask of hurt and anger as he stormed downstairs, heading toward the kitchen where Lena was getting ready for her day, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit her. I followed, feeling the weight of every step. It felt unreal, like some terrible nightmare that I was walking through but couldn't wake up from. When Lena saw Michael, she smiled, and for a second, it was almost like everything was normal. She had no idea that her secret was out, that the foundation of our family was about to be shattered beyond repair. Mom, Michael said, his voice barely controlled. I need to talk to you. She froze, sensing the tension. Of course, honey. What's wrong? She asked, her tone a little too sweet, like she was trying to brush off the weight in his words. He shot her a hard look. Dad told me everything, he said, his voice cracking just enough to show the pain beneath his anger. Lena glanced at me, a flicker of panic crossing her face. What are you talking about? She replied, her voice soft but tense. You know exactly what I'm talking about, he nearly shouted. You and Adam, my friend. How could you, Mom? With him. The color drained from Lena's face, and she stepped back as if struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with guilt and panic. She looked at me, pleading silently, but I had nothing to give her. Michael, sweetheart, it's not what you think, she stammered, reaching out to him. Michael recoiled, his face twisted with betrayal. Don't touch me, he said, stepping away. How could you do this to Dad? To me? Tears spilled down Lena's cheeks, but I couldn't find it in myself to feel sympathy. Not now. She looked at me again, desperate. Can we please talk about this privately? She begged. No, Michael said, his voice louder and more determined. You ruined that when you lied to all of us. He was shaking, and I could see the toll this was taking on him, but he was determined to get answers, to make her face what she'd done. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It's complicated. I was feeling lost, and Adam was just someone I could talk to. It just went too far. Michael let out a bitter laugh. Someone you could talk to? He's 16, Mom. He's my friend. You're his teacher. The weight of that hit her hard, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. I know I made a mistake, but please, Michael, try to understand. Understand? He interrupted. How am I supposed to understand that my mom would do something like this? That you would ruin our family for what, Mom? His words were like punches, raw and full of pain. She was openly sobbing now, reaching out, but he turned away, looking to me instead. Dad, what happens now? He asked, his face crumbling, looking every bit like the child he still was beneath his anger and confusion. I don't know yet, I said, my voice heavy, because honestly, I didn't. How could I? Lena had broken something so fundamental, something that held us together, and I had no idea how to fix it. All I knew was that my son was hurting, and the woman I'd once loved was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. Lena slumped onto a chair, her face buried in her hands as she cried, but I felt no sympathy. This was a mess of her own making, and she dragged all of us into it. But I had a choice to make. One that would affect not only me, but Michael too. And I had no idea where to even start. After the confrontation, the house felt hollow, like the walls themselves were recoiling from what had happened. Lena was still in the kitchen, slumped over the table, crying softly. I took Michael by the shoulder and led him upstairs, away from her, away from the chaos she'd unleashed. We sat on his bed in silence for a while, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, what are we supposed to do now?" His voice was barely a whisper, a mix of anger and heartbreak. Seeing him like that broke something in me. He was just a kid who shouldn't have to grapple with betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect him. "I don't know, Michael," I admitted, putting my arm around him. "But whatever happens, we'll get through this together." He nodded, but his face remained blank, as if he was still struggling to process everything. "I can't believe she'd do this with Adam. It's like she didn't even care about us." It hurt to hear him say that, but I couldn't disagree. She had broken not just my trust, but his, and I didn't know if that was something he could ever truly heal from. I didn't know if I could either. For the rest of the day, we stayed upstairs. I tried to distract Michael with a movie, but his mind kept drifting, his gaze turning distant as he replayed the confrontation in his head. I knew he was struggling, and I didn't have the right words to make it better. All I could do was stay beside him and let him know he wasn't alone in this. Hours passed before I finally went back downstairs. Lena was still at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up at me, searching my face for some sign of forgiveness or understanding, but all I felt was anger. I sat across from her, the silence thick and tense. "How could you do this, Lena?" I finally asked, my voice cold. "With him? A kid? Our son's friend?" She opened her mouth, struggling to find the right words, but nothing she could say would justify it. "I know what I did was wrong, but please try to understand. I was just so lost. It was never supposed to go this far." "Lost?" I repeated, incredulous. "So you think that justifies wrecking our family, humiliating Michael?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to understand. But I need you to know that it was never about hurting you or Michael. I made a horrible mistake. A mistake. That was all she could call it. Like it was just an accident, a minor misstep. But it was so much more than that. It was a betrayal that ran deeper than I could put into words. We're past excuses, Lena," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "This wasn't just a mistake. This was something that shattered our family. Michael knows now, and you've left us both trying to pick up the pieces while you sit here and cry about how sorry you are. It's not enough." She closed her eyes, her face contorted in regret. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she whispered. "I'll go to counseling. I'll get help, anything. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." I shook my head, feeling nothing but exhaustion. "I don't know if there's any fixing this. You didn't just betray me, Lena. You broke something in Michael. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to get that back." For the first time, she seemed to fully grasp the gravity of what she'd done. But her tears and her guilt didn't sway me. She had made her choices, and now we were all forced to live with the consequences. And no amount of apologies would change that. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with a million questions and a cold, aching emptiness beside me. Lena had moved into the guest room at my insistence, but even knowing she wasn't lying beside me brought no relief. All I could think about was Michael, the pain in his face, the betrayal I could see weighing down his shoulders. It was the same look I'd seen in the mirror every time I tried to close my eyes. How was I supposed to protect him from this? And how could I ever trust Lena again, knowing what she was capable of? I thought about leaving, about packing a bag for Michael and me and never looking back. But it wasn't that simple. There were still so many questions to answer, decisions to make. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. By the time the sun rose, I hadn't slept at all. My mind had been replaying the same scenes, cycling through the anger, the disbelief, and the heartbreak. I wanted to run, to shield Michael from this mess, but I knew running wasn't going to solve anything. No matter what I did, the damage had already been done. That morning, I pulled Lena aside. She looked tired, her eyes swollen from crying all night, but I didn't have any sympathy left for her. We need to talk about next steps, I said, my voice cold and businesslike. She nodded, swallowing hard. I know, she whispered. Just tell me what you need. I took a breath, steadying myself. I'm not even sure what I need yet, Lena. I can't just forget what you did, especially not with Michael in the middle of this. She looked down, her expression full of guilt and regret. I know I hurt him. I'd give anything to undo it, to take it back. But you can't, I said bluntly, cutting through the sentiment. And now I have to figure out what's best for him. He's all that matters to me right now. Lena nodded, understanding. I want to do what's best for him too, she said softly. If that means giving you both space, then I'll move out. The words hung between us, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar weight of sadness. The idea of Michael and me, alone, without the family I'd worked so hard to build. It felt like a defeat, like admitting that everything I'd ever believed about my marriage had been a lie. You're willing to leave? I asked, more out of surprise than anything else. Lena looked up at me, her face full of sorrow. If that's what it takes to keep you and Michael from being hurt any further, then yes, I'll leave. I don't want to, but I understand if that's what needs to happen. I nodded, trying to process it all. I didn't know if I could forgive her, or if I even wanted to try. But I knew Michael needed stability, a safe place to come to terms with all of this. And right now, I wasn't sure he could have that with her around. We'll figure out the details later, I said, my voice weary. But for now, it's probably best if you stay with your sister or find a place nearby. Michael and I need some time to work through this. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she nodded in agreement. I understand, she whispered, her voice broken. I just want you both to know I'm sorry. I said nothing in return. Apologies weren't enough. There was no quick fix, no easy way out of this nightmare. As Lena began packing a small bag, I turned and walked back up the stairs to Michael's room, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. We were stepping into unknown territory, one I never thought we'd have to face. And all I could do was hope that somewhere down this difficult road, we'd find a way to heal. Lena left that afternoon. She gathered a few things in a small duffel bag, her face pale and tense as she moved quietly through the house, trying not to disturb Michael or draw his attention. I could tell it broke her, leaving without knowing when or if she'd be coming back. But she didn't argue or try to plead with me again. Maybe she'd finally understood that her words couldn't erase what she'd done. When she closed the door behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. It was just me and Michael now, standing in the wreckage of what had once been our family. He came downstairs after she left, his expression stoic but his eyes telling a different story. He looked at me, waiting for some kind of reassurance, a sense that things would be okay. But I didn't have that to give, not yet. For the first few days, we barely spoke. We went through the motions, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of the new reality we'd been forced into. Michael kept to himself, spending hours in his room, either doing schoolwork or just lying there, staring at the ceiling. I wanted to reach out to him, to talk to him about what had happened, but I didn't know where to start. I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of reopening wounds that hadn't even had a chance to begin healing. Instead, I tried to keep things as normal as possible. I made dinner each night, simple meals I knew he liked, though neither of us ate much. We'd sit at the table in silence, the empty chair where Lena used to sit a constant reminder of the life we'd lost. Occasionally, I'd catch him looking at the door, as if expecting her to walk through it at any moment. Each time, he'd quickly look away, his face a mix of anger and sadness. One evening, after several days of silence, Michael finally spoke up. We were sitting in the living room, watching a movie neither of us was really paying attention to. Out of nowhere, he turned to me and asked, "Dad, are we going to be okay?" The question hit me hard. He was just a kid, struggling to make sense of a situation no one should have to go through, let alone at his age. I wanted to tell him everything would be fine, that we'd get through this and be stronger for it. But I couldn't bring myself to lie to him. "I don't know, Michael," I said honestly. "I'd like to think we will be, but it's going to take time. A lot of time. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. I miss how things used to be, he whispered. I miss Mom, but I don't know if I can forgive her. Hearing him say that broke something in me. I wanted to tell him that forgiveness was something we could work toward, but I realized I didn't know if I could forgive her either. I felt just as lost as he did. We don't have to decide that right now, I said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. Right now, it's okay to just feel whatever you're feeling. We'll take it one day at a time, and we'll figure this out together. Michael looked up at me, a glimmer of relief in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step forward in a sea of uncertainty. We sat there for a while, just being there for each other in the silence, finding a strange sort of comfort in knowing we weren't alone in this. As the days passed, we fell into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, and it didn't feel natural, but it was ours. We were navigating this new life, learning to be a family of two, holding on to each other in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. There was still so much to sort through, so much to face, but at least we were doing it together. For now, that was enough. Weeks passed, and while Lena was physically gone, her presence lingered in every room. The weight of her absence was like a ghost haunting us, and as much as I tried to create some sense of normalcy for Michael, I knew he was struggling. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and I could tell that every thought of hers brought a fresh ache of betrayal. One evening, I got a message from Lena. It was a short text asking if she could speak to Michael. She claimed to understand if he wasn't ready, but she missed him. She wanted to explain. Part of me wanted to deny her any connection, to shield Michael from her, but another part recognized he'd eventually need to confront her, to ask his own questions. I showed him the text, bracing myself for his reaction. Michael read it slowly, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he sighed, I don't want to talk to her right now, Dad, but maybe someday. His voice was small, uncertain. He was holding his pain close, not yet ready to let her back into his world. And though I felt torn, I respected his decision, texting her back that he needed more time. She replied with a quiet, I understand, but I could sense the disappointment in her message. Michael's pain was hers to bear now, and no words could lessen the burden she placed on him. The holidays arrived, and with them came the realization of just how deeply the cracks in our family had formed. Normally, the season was one of laughter, memories, and tradition, but this year, it felt hollow. Michael and I went through the motions, putting up the tree, baking cookies, watching holiday movies, but there was an unspoken sadness between us, an emptiness we didn't know how to fill. On Christmas morning, we sat together, unwrapping gifts quietly. He smiled a little at the book I got him and tried to feign enthusiasm, but we both knew it wasn't the same. There was no Lena sneaking pictures, no bustling around the kitchen preparing brunch. I caught Michael staring at the tree, his eyes glassy. It broke me to see him so lost, so aware of how much things had changed. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how strong I tried to be for him, the wounds Lena had inflicted would be with us for a long, long time. One afternoon, a few weeks after the holiday, a handwritten letter arrived from Lena. She'd written it to both of us, carefully explaining her regret, the emptiness that had led her down such a destructive path. She apologized for everything, for failing us, for hurting us, and begged us to try to understand, even if we couldn't forgive. Michael read it first, his face impassive, but afterward he handed it to me without a word. As I read, her sorrow felt genuine, but I couldn't help feeling numb. How could words make up for the pain she'd caused? I knew she wanted absolution, but I couldn't offer it. Not yet. Michael asked me if he had to write her back. Not if you're not ready, I told him, and he shook his head, a flicker of anger in his eyes, saying, she made her choices. I don't owe her anything right now. Eventually, it became clear that we needed more than just each other to navigate this. I suggested therapy, hesitating to ask Michael if he'd be open to it, but he surprised me by agreeing. Maybe it'll help, he said quietly, a glimmer of hope in his voice. We started going together, both of us working through the hurt, the confusion, the anger. It was hard at first, reliving the betrayal, opening up about how much it had affected us. Michael talked about the guilt he felt for missing his mother, how he wanted to hate her, but also wanted things to go back to how they were. I admitted to my own anger and shame, confessing how lost I felt without the family I'd once believed in. Therapy didn't fix everything, but it gave us a space to start piecing ourselves back together. Months after she left, Michael and I ran into Lena unexpectedly at the grocery store. She looked surprised, almost hesitant, and I saw her struggle to hold herself together as Michael froze, clearly unprepared for the encounter. "Michael," she whispered, her voice soft, "I've missed you." He looked at her, his face torn between love and betrayal. I can't do this here, Mom." He turned and walked away, leaving me with Lena. She looked at me with a mixture of pain and hope, but I had nothing left to offer her. "Just give him time," I said, the words feeling both cruel and comforting. She nodded, understanding. She had taken away his sense of safety, and she would have to wait for him to find it again before he could let her back in point one evening. After months of silence, Michael knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. He'd been going over things in his mind, trying to understand why his mother had done what she'd done, even though he knew he might never get real answers. "I think I want to talk to her," he admitted, his voice hesitant but determined. "Are you sure?" I asked, not wanting him to rush into something he wasn't ready for. He nodded, and in his eyes, I saw the strength he'd found through the months of pain and healing. It was his choice now, and I could see that he wanted to take control of his life, to find peace on his terms. I promised to support him, to be there however he needed, and we planned for him to meet Lena at a nearby park, with me waiting close by in case he needed me. The day Michael met with Lena was one of the hardest, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. They spoke for hours, and when he came back to the car, he looked exhausted, drained. But there was also a hint of relief. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her," he told me later, "but I needed to say what I felt, to tell her what she took from me." In the months that followed, we started to find our footing, rebuilding our lives with an understanding of what had been lost and what still remained. The pain didn't vanish, but it dulled over time, and Michael and I grew closer, a bond forged in the fire of betrayal and healing. Lena remained a part of his life, but at a distance, an occasional presence rather than a constant. We were moving forward, not as the family we'd once been, but as something new. And while it wasn't the life I'd planned, it was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt we could find happiness there.